Hi, I'm Dr. Richard Bolzakelli with Catholic Studies Academy. Today we'll be asking the question, is it really a matter of sacrilege for a child before receiving his first communion not to go to confession? So understand what I'm asking here, right? The question isn't whether it is the case that a child is required to go to confession before receiving his first communion, but rather the question of whether, if he does not, it would be a matter of sacrilege. I think the answer to that question is probably not. Now, why is that the case? Well, the sacrilege would occur if the child had committed a grave sin prior to receiving Eucharist, but not repenting of it and being sacramentally absolved. So, in order for a grave sin to occur, a person must a person must act with sufficient knowledge that he would be culpable of this action and sufficient freedom of will, or we can put it this way, right, a sufficient degree of self-possession such that the child would, in fact, again, be culpable, right? So in order to be culpable, one requires to know what one is doing and also to be able to freely be able to choose to do it or not. Now, in theory, right, a child at the age of discretion, 7 years old, roughly, right, give or take, this is the time when we admit children in the Western Church, right, in the Latin Rite of Catholicism, to Holy Communion for the first time. So we baptize as an infant, but then later, right, at a later point, when the child reaches the age of discretion, we admit the child to Holy Communion, at which time we require, as a matter of discipline, the sacrament of reconciliation before First Holy Communion is received. Now, in theory, right, hypothetically, it's possible to commit mortal sin once one reaches the age of discretion, because at that age, it becomes possible to know what one is doing. But as any parent knows who's raised a child from infancy to adulthood, really the kind of self-awareness and self-control that a child of the age of 7 possesses is radically limited in comparison to what we find in an adult. The idea that 7-year-old children, because they can form a syllogism in their minds, are miniature adults strikes most experienced parents as kind of ludicrous. And in fact, in general society, we don't allow them to enter into contract or to get married at that age, precisely because we think they have no idea what they're doing. So, is it possible for them to commit mortal sin? Well, yes, it's possible. Is it likely? Not especially. So where does that leave us with this discipline that we require them to receive the sacrament of reconciliation before going to confession, or before receiving communion for the first time? This really has to do with habituating a child to turn away from sin and toward God, and to avail himself of the sacraments that God supplies for his faithful for that purpose. The Church recognizes the benefit, right, of receiving the sacrament of reconciliation in what's described as a devotional way, right? So when, in other words, we do not actually have mortal sin, but nonetheless, right, we sacramentalize through this particular liturgical context our examination of conscience, right? So in this process, we repent of our venial sins, and we separate ourselves even further from any attachment to the sins of our past, if there are any, that we may have committed. Keep in mind that mortal sin of its very nature is something that we can either do or not do, and this means that it's entirely possible, at least hypothetically, to go through the whole of one's life without ever committing a mortal sin. If we're really fortunate and well habituated from the time that we're young, maybe that could be us. Now, I'm not I know whenever someone talks this way, people think it's outlandish speech, and they think maybe it's arrogant, as if I'm suggesting that I myself have committed no mortal sins in the context of my life. In fact, I'm quite confident that that is not the case with me. But uh, the point is, it's hypothetically possible. So if we bring children to the confessional before they've ever committed a mortal sin, and we habituate themselves to turn to God through that sacrament and away from their sins, then it makes the likelihood that they will commit mortal sin that much more reduced, right? It's that much less likely that a child or an adult who's lived his life with this kind of habituation will turn radically against God through mortal sin, right? So if what we're doing is we're giving the child the best hope of a life without sin, and should he fall in the future in a grave and serious way, we're giving him the habit of turning back rather than remaining distant from God. Thank you.